Hello, and welcome to the Mushroom Murder Trial podcast. My name is Lisa. Thank you so much for joining me today. And we are going to be talking about Erin Patterson's life in solitary confinement. Now, although I think what she did was truly hideous, a crime that shattered lives and shook a community, I can't bring myself to support her being held in solitary confinement year after year. Now, let me know what you think about this, because you may have a different view to me, and if you're on YouTube, you can certainly type it in the comments. But I believe no matter how repulsive her actions were, this prolonged isolation is inhumane. It strips a person of their sanity and humanity. Well, did she have much humanity before? I'm not sure. But it serves no purpose but cruelty. And we're going to be looking down the barrel very, very soon of two possible appeal applications. And there's also movement behind the scenes with experts who are coming in looking at challenging Erin's prison conditions. Now, we've also got one that's mooted by Erin's team against her verdict, and then there's the other by the state against her sentence. Now, as many of you may know, she's being held at the Dame Phyllis Frost Centre in Deer Park, which is outside of Melbourne. It is a maximum security prison for women, and there's only two such prisons in the state. Now, during her sentencing hearing in August, the court heard Erin was a keen crocheter inside the prison, and her personal items inside the cell include wool for crocheting, blankets she has knit herself, a hair straightener, and a computer. Her barrister, Colin Mandy, told the court his client reported hearing other prisoners screaming and yelling at times. Now, according to Dr. Clive Solomon in the Independent Australia, quote, around the world, correctional systems manage high-profile or vulnerable prisoners without condemning them to decades of isolation. Protective custody units, structured interaction with staff. Now, this is the one bit I don't truly understand. She gets her meal delivered to her in a slot by the prison officers. Now, why can't they open the door and have a brief chat with her? So that's how Erin gets her meals every day, and then she has to eat the meters from the toilet. Now, what Dr. Solomon is saying is protective custody units provide structured interaction with staff, sunlight and exercise, and small group contact. Now, I think she was in that, but didn't work out. We haven't had a lot of details. They can all safeguard both the prisoner and the public without crossing into torture. That's what he's saying. To pretend that solitary confinement is the only option is not professionalism, it's cruelty. Now, under the United Nations Mandela rules, they define prolonged solitary confinement as more than 15 days and explicitly prohibit it as cruel, inhumane and degrading. And Erin has been in solitary for about 400 days. Now, Dame Phyllis Frost is an institution that's been rocked by scandal since it welcomed its first detainees in 1996. In 2003, a male prison guard was charged with the R word, a mentally ill prisoner. It was only discovered when the inmate was found to be pregnant while she was transferred to a mental health hospital. And the guard couldn't exactly deny the crime because the DNA test soon revealed he was the father. As well as this, reports in 2009 revealed heroin and methamphetamine were readily available in the jail. I don't think that's relevant to Erin, just because she's away from everyone. I don't know how she could possibly get. Just my opinion. I'm not an expert. There have been, over time, increases in overdoses and, the S word, attempts. The Victorian government decided to take over healthcare across the state's women's prisons after an Indigenous woman died in custody in the year 2000 at the prison after making repeated calls for medical assistance. I know they have a tough job to do. I understand. They're probably underfunded as well, but you don't have to be cruel. So Since Erin's arrest in November 2023, she spent much of her time in the Gordon unit. It's a restrictive area with about 20 cells. Her daily routine includes being locked in her area for about 22 hours a day. Plus, meals and medication are delivered through a flap in her cell. That's why they refer to it as the slot. There is a small concrete yard adjoining her cell, so it's about 2 metres by 1.5 metres. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to me, so I had a look at it. That's the size of a small bathroom or a large shower enclosure. It is a space large enough to fit a toilet, a small sink, and a shower or a small bath. Now, Erin may access this exercise area with permission, but use of even that is restricted if another prisoner is using the larger yard. So she's obviously under significant threat, and she's a complicated prisoner for the institution to deal with. So I'm not criticising them. I'm talking about us as a society and what we will and we won't tolerate. And you know I don't like Erin. So don't come for me, please. So she can speak to only one other prisoner on a very limited basis and must ask permission for even that. Access to communal areas such as the library is heavily limited. That is something Erin would really want to spend a lot of time in. And sometimes there are frequent lockdowns driven by staff shortages, which make it impossible or very difficult for her to leave the cell or access normal prison programs. She loves books, so not being able to get to the library, I imagine that would bring down her mood a lot. Now, in her sentencing, Justice Christopher Beale recognised that her conditions, quote, do not sound very humane. They were taken into account determining her sentence, namely the length of the non-parole period, 33 years. The judge weighed in that being held in near isolation makes the punishment more burdensome. The DPP is now appealing this sentence on the grounds that it was too lenient. Prosecutors argued that the justice erred in assuming that Patterson would necessarily stay in solitary or extremely restrictive conditions, quote, for years to come. They say the evidence was not clear enough. According to the University of Queensland's Law School, solitary confinement in Australia is often referred to as segregation, separate confinement, isolation, non-association, or lockdowns, depending on the jurisdiction. It's used in prison for adults, at youth detention centres, sometimes in forensic or mental health facilities. It may be ordered for safety, for discipline, for security, or to isolate prisoners who are disruptive or pose risk to others or themselves. There are very few statutory limits in many jurisdictions on how long someone can be held in these states. Sometimes no limit on the number of consecutive orders of safety or maximum security. Now, the human rights concerns are psychological effects. It's associated with serious psychological harm, including exacerbation of mental illness, self-harm, that S-word, ideation. Even short periods can have worsening effects. It has disproportionate effects on vulnerable groups, young people, Indigenous detainees, those with mental illness or intellectual disability. And that was according to the humanrightsjournal.org. It's believed that rights against cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment, rights to humane treatment, right to exercise, right to fresh air and social interaction are potentially being violated. Now, I had a look at some cases that have come up in this particular human rights area. And there was one in the Supreme Court of Queensland, and it was Owen Darcy, the Chief Executive of the Queensland Corrective Services in 2021. He'd been in solitary type confinement under a maximum security order since 2013, so for many years. The court heard his continuing confinement was not compatible with Queensland's Human Rights Act of 2019 and was unlawful. It emphasised that indefinite or prolonged solitary confinement raises serious human rights issues. That's from the Human Rights Law Centre. And in 2023, there was the Western Australian Supreme Court youth detainees at Banksia Hill and Unit 18. Now, 3 young Aboriginal detainees were held for long periods, combined 167 days, under, quote, rolling lockdowns. They're a problem too at Danefields Frost. Cell confinement in youth detention and adult prison units without the proper authorisation and without access to required exercise, etc. The court found the confinement was unlawful and injunction was granted to prevent further confinement without proper legal orders, and emphasised that frequent solitary confinement for children is inconsistent with humane treatment. It undermines rehabilitation and violates both statutory and human rights obligations. Now, we've also got the Supermax killers in New South Wales, Hamzy and Sleeman. This was the Supreme Court in 2009. The 2 convicted murderers in the Goulburn Supermax, apparently that's a terrible prison, were placed in isolation after an alleged plot for mass escape. They claimed that Corrective Services Commissioner ignored due process in the imposition of isolation. The court granted them leave, permission to sue for damages. It did not necessarily mean they succeeded in all claims, but the case showed courts are willing to examine procedure in imposing solitary confinement. And that's from the ABC. So courts across Australia are increasingly regarding prolonged or indefinite solitary confinement, especially without periodic review, as raising serious compatibility issues with human rights or cruelty and degrading treatment. Particular concern for vulnerable detainees, minors, those with mental illness or intellectual disability, and Indigenous people. And there is cumulative harm, according to SBS. Even if each instance is, quote, short, repeated or rolling confinements, i.e. lockdowns, can amount to the effect of isolation and prolonged isolation. And also the law's very vague here. And the other issue that we have is there's a lack of transparency. So we don't really know what's going on. It's difficult to get reliable data. And this is from the Human Rights Journal. So we don't know how many people in Australia are held in solitary, for how long, and whether the proper processes are followed. So that is what I have for you today, but I would like to see if you want more podcasts on this particular subject, because there are a few experts I can interview. So let me know if you would be interested in that. But thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I think the deadline for Erin is next week with the appeal. So we shall see what happens there. But thank you so much, and we will chat to you very soon. Thanks. Bye.